Welcome to Spotlight Murders. I am your host, Kieran Caldwell, and today we're diving deep into one of the most controversial murders in music history, the assassination of John Lennon and the man behind it, December 8th, 1980, a date that would forever change music history. On this cold Monday evening in New York City, John Lennon, former Beatle, peace activist, and musical icon, was gunned down outside his home at the Dakota apartment building. The shooter wasn't a stranger lurking in the shadows. He was a fan, a 25-year-old man from Hawaii named Mark David Chapman, who had traveled over 4,800 miles with one purpose: to meet his hero and then kill him. But this isn't just a story about a murder. This is a story about obsession, identity, and the dangerous intersection of fame and mental illness. It's about a man who became so lost in fantasy that he transformed from devoted fan to cold-blooded killer. And perhaps most disturbing of all, it's about how the very people who tried to understand Chapman's mind, some of the nation's top psychiatrists, found themselves facing one of the most enigmatic cases they'd ever encountered. I'm going to take you inside the twisted psyche of Mark David Chapman, through the memories of those who knew him, the experts who examined him, and the chilling details that emerge from one of the most shocking crimes of the 20th century. Craving a true crime podcast that unravels the twisted minds of killers and dark truths? Scoob is an AI-powered podcast that offers in-depth, binge-worthy episodes exploring infamous celebrity murder cases like John Lennon's assassination, Tupac Shakur's unsolved murder, Tate LaBianca murders, and more. Join thousands of listeners across the U.S. today. Download Scoob now, available on the App Store and Play Store. Returning to the case of John Lennon's murder, let's first understand his killer, Mark Chapman. To gauge what Mark David Chapman did on December 8th, 1980, you first have to understand who Mark David Chapman was, or, more accurately, who he wasn't. Because the most disturbing thing about Chapman wasn't his capacity for violence. It was his complete lack of a genuine self. Dr. J. Martin, a leading expert on identity disorders, studied Chapman's case extensively. What he found was a man who had spent his entire life mimicking the personalities of those around him, taking on the identities of friends he admired. Chapman was always the sidekick, never the star. Each time he assumed someone else's facade, he felt increasingly devoid of an independent personality. This wasn't just teenage insecurity. This was a fundamental absence of self that would plague him throughout his life. Chapman himself would later reflect on this terrifying void. He had no real substance, no lasting personality of his own. He was a human chameleon, constantly shapeshifting to fit whatever role he thought would bring him acceptance or meaning. But chameleons, as we know, are fragile creatures. And when Chapman's carefully constructed facades began to crumble, he would reach for the most dangerous identity of all, a fictional character from a book. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand how Chapman became a killer, we need to go back to the beginning, to a troubled childhood that would set the stage for everything that followed. Mark David Chapman's relationship with his parents painted a stark picture of dysfunction that would echo throughout his life. His mother, Diane, embodied warmth and humor, qualities that stood in sharp contrast to his father's reserved, work-focused demeanor. David Chapman was a man who adhered strictly to monotonous routines, emotionally distant and lacking in what his son would later call emotional literacy. Despite fulfilling the conventional roles of a father, abstaining from alcohol, being physically present, participating in activities like Boy Scouts and Indian Guides, David Chapman failed to express affection or engage in meaningful conversations with his son. Mark seldom recalled shared moments of tenderness or declarations of love from his father. The man who should have been his role model was instead an enigma, dutiful yet emotionally distant, unable to connect with his family. The most vivid memory etched in Mark's mind from his childhood was a Thanksgiving dinner marked by volcanic unpredictability. His father descended the stairs, muttering and cursing before picking up the Thanksgiving turkey with bare hands and smashing it on the table. a moment that perfectly captured the intimidating and unstable presence his father represented. This emotional neglect would fester into something far more dangerous. Mark openly harbored feelings of deep-seated rage against his father, and even expressed having violent thoughts toward him. In his darkest fantasies, he imagined confronting his father with a loaded gun, threatening him with the words, "I hear you're scared to death that you're going to hell, and this is it, Dad." The irony wasn't lost on Chapman that he was repeating the same cycle of abandonment. Just as his father had failed him, Chapman would later recognize that he was failing his own relationships, trapped in patterns of emotional dysfunction that seemed impossible to break. This recognition would contribute to a profound sense of self-loathing that would eventually find its target in John Lennon. At 14, Mark David Chapman discovered two things that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of his life: the Beatles and psychedelic drugs. His bedroom, like countless American teenagers, was adorned with vibrant posters of John, Paul, George, and Ringo. But for Chapman, this wasn't just teenage fandom. It was the beginning of an obsession that would consume him. His fascination began with the Magical Mystery Tour album, which sparked his curiosity about the drug culture the Beatles had embraced. By this era, the Fab Four had transformed from the clean-cut musicians of the early 60s into advocates of long hair, beards, meditation, and drug use. For a troubled teenager looking for an identity, this transformation offered a template for reinvention. Burdened by unresolved family conflicts and the humiliation of social interactions gone wrong, Chapman began crafting new personas to navigate his chaotic emotions. Mark the Freak was the first in a series of identities he would adopt over the next decade. Identities that would ultimately culminate in the fixated persona that would mark him as one of his generation's most infamous assassins. The summer of 1969 was pivotal. The psychedelic culture, initially inspired by the Beatles and epitomizing peace and love, began to splinter amid the violence of events like the Manson murders. Concurrently, Chapman embarked on what he nostalgically termed his innocent phase of drug experimentation, a period that would dominate his life for the next 2 years. Guided by a 16-year-old neighbor, whom Chapman viewed as both mentor and surrogate elder brother, he was introduced to LSD. His first trip was almost comically naive. Secluded in his bedroom, he succumbed to fits of laughter while watching, ironically, a documentary about drug abuse on television. When his father checked on him due to the loud laughter, Chapman dismissed it as a reaction to a funny TV show. His father simply closed the door, leaving Chapman to his altered state. But beneath the drug-induced euphoria, something darker was brewing. Chapman's resentment toward those who had humiliated him was growing like a malignant undercurrent. The teenager who perceived himself as too cowardly to confront schoolyard bullies was nurturing a festering anger that would eventually demand an outlet. In late 1970, Mark David Chapman experienced what appeared to be a profound spiritual transformation. A classmate at Columbia High School invited him to a religious retreat organized by Chapel Woods Presbyterian Church. Chapman, having no initial interest in religion, was sold on the idea when his friend mentioned there would be many girls there. During this retreat, Chapman reconnected with Jessica Blankenship, a former neighbor and childhood friend. They had shared a second-grade classroom, and Jessica remembered standing beside him in the class photo, a memory that wasn't fondly preserved in Chapman's mind. Before that photo was taken, he had awkwardly tucked his shirt tail into his pants, and when the yearbook was released, it showed his white cotton underwear peeking conspicuously over his belt. Nearly 9 years later, they laughed about the incident, but it was another reminder of Chapman's lifelong struggle with humiliation and shame. At the retreat, Chapman was successfully integrated into a group of Christian teenagers who encouraged him to play guitar in their rock band. Among these new connections, Michael McFarland emerged as a significant figure, someone Chapman would later describe as his first true alter ego. It was McFarland who recommended that Chapman read The Catcher in the Rye, insisting that he read it immediately. Chapman was captivated by a film about Jesus and profoundly moved by both a lecture and a pamphlet outlining the spiritual laws of Christianity. Although he didn't convert immediately, he noted October 25, 1970, as what he believed was his first spiritual turning point. But Chapman's religious phase would prove as unstable as everything else in his life. Upon returning to school, he slipped back into his former persona, Mark the Freak, despite acting like a Christian around his new religious friends. For 8 months, he lived a dual life, maintaining connections with both religious and non-religious peers, existing simultaneously in the psychedelic rock culture and the fundamentalist Christian world. This chaotic duality reached a dangerous climax during another religious retreat when Chapman distributed LSD and other substances to unseasoned young Christians. As the drugs took effect, one youth's erratic behavior, running naked into a lake while declaring, "I'm a soggy reefer," left church elders bewildered and concerned. Chapman's inability to maintain any consistent identity was becoming increasingly destructive, not just to himself, but to those around him. As Chapman's enthusiasm for fervent Christianity began to wane, he found solace in an unexpected place: the music of Todd Rundgren, an artist who had once clashed musically with John Lennon. For Chapman, Rundgren's music provided everything he needed to express his identity, encapsulating his sentiments and emotions through lyrics that resonated with his soul. Chapman viewed himself as a sensitive and poetic individual who sought to express his emotions through artful harmony rather than meaningless chatter. Rundgren's music presented an ideal platform for his psyche, offering a sense of belonging, even if only to an audience composed of his own imagination. While he had initially been championed by the Beatles, it was Rundgren who eventually became the most impactful musical influence in his life. Gloria Chapman, Mark's wife, later recalled that Rundgren, rather than John Lennon, wielded the greatest influence over her husband. Mark frequently expressed his belief that Rundgren was a true musical genius, a sentiment not widely echoed due to Rundgren's relative obscurity. This unheralded status made Mark proud to be an early devotee, distinguishing him among fans. Chapman maintained multiple complete collections of Rundgren's work, though he would periodically part with them through sales or gifts. He had an uncanny ability to discern intricate and nuanced elements in the music. He could even recite lyrics from overdubbed harmonies that featured multiple vocal tracks simultaneously. But there was something troubling about this obsession. The excellence of Rundgren's music would bring Chapman into states of despondency, forcing him to temporarily abandon the albums only to purchase them again later. During his first visit to New York, Chapman equipped himself with a cassette player and numerous Rundgren tapes. Among these was Deface the Music, an album deliberately designed to mimic the Beatles' sound while differing in lyrical composition. Chapman was particularly drawn to these works, but what he may not have realized at the time was that Rundgren was providing him with an outlet for the pent-up rage he harbored toward Lennon. The animosity between Lennon and Rundgren had surfaced through public exchanges in Melody Maker magazine. Lennon derogatorily referred to Rundgren as Todd Rundgren, while Rundgren retaliated by critiquing Lennon's advocacy of revolution as disingenuous. Ultimately, Rundgren declared his mockery of Lennon with the 1980 album Deface the Music, and a particular track called Rock and Roll Pussy, which disparaged Lennon and Yoko Ono's superficial commitment to revolutionary causes. Deface the Music served as a pastiche of Beatles classics, with songs like I Wanna Hold Your Hand, reimagined as I Just Wanna Touch You. The project culminated in Everybody Else Is Wrong, which ingeniously wove together elements from Across the Universe and I Am the Walrus. Years later, while confined at Attica prison, Chapman would reflect on the profound personal significance Rundgren's music held for him. On the day he assassinated Lennon, he left Rundgren's album The Ballad of Todd Rundgren in his New York City hotel room, a symbolic statement reflecting the deep and lasting impact Rundgren's artistry had on him. For Chapman, Rundgren was more than an icon. He was a crucial element in the emotional tapestry of his life, and perhaps unknowingly, a catalyst for the rage that would eventually consume him. The recommendation to read The Catcher in the Rye would prove to be one of the most dangerous suggestions Mark David Chapman ever received. The book, given to him by his friend Michael McFarlane during his religious phase, would eventually become the foundation for the most elaborate and deadly fantasy of his life. Chapman perceived John Lennon not as a real person, but as an abstract figure projected in his mind. This detachment made it surprisingly simple for him to weave Lennon into a complex narrative that would dictate his actions and mindset. By adopting this perspective, Chapman justified the act of murder by transforming himself into the fictional character Holden Caulfield. Chapman interpreted Salinger's narrative in such a way that he believed Lennon's death would grant him an identity as the catcher in the rye for his era, a role that would bestow a sense of literary grandeur upon what was, in reality, a desperate and cowardly action. He envisioned shooting Lennon from behind and then wrapping himself in a fetal position beside the bleeding musician, finally melting into the ink-stained world of his literary hero. Dr. J. Martin, a leading expert on Holden Caulfield, examined Chapman's case and found it representative of individuals who lack personal identity and find solace in fictional characters. These figures are unchanging and provide a stable connection to reality. They embody stories worth emulating and are reassuringly predictable. For young adults suffering from depression, a group to which Chapman belonged due to psychological traumas in his youth, The Catcher in the Rye offers an enticing identity. What many overlook is Holden Caulfield's deeply depressed state. Revisiting the book reveals Holden's emotional wounds and depression, which mirrored the turmoil Chapman experienced, including his suicidal tendencies and the emotional collapse that preceded Lennon's murder. Martin describes fictive personalities as substitutes for a self threatened with annihilation, perfectly capturing Chapman's inner turmoil. But Chapman's meticulously constructed fantasy would crumble when the reality of the shooting unfolded differently than expected. Instead of Lennon collapsing instantly at his feet, the wounded musician sprang up and dashed up the stone steps, only collapsing after crashing through a glass door at the Dakota building's entryway. This unexpected turn left Chapman in shock, and for 2 months after the attack, he remained trapped in his delusion while awaiting trial at Rikers Island. The transformation into Holden Caulfield played a cruel irony, sabotaging Chapman's carefully crafted insanity plea. If successful, it might have returned this intelligent and manipulative sociopath to the type of controlled setting, like a mental hospital, where he had previously thrived in manipulating those around him. Instead, by fully embodying the chaotic and confused nature of Holden Caulfield, Chapman fell into his own web of deceit and delusion. Obsessed with the final hours before history's most shocking celebrity murders, Scoob takes you beyond the headlines, into the quiet moments, strange encounters, and subtle clues that led to the world's most infamous killings involving public figures. Our fast-paced, expertly researched episodes spotlight the details others miss. Join over 50,000 true crime fans who know it's not just what happened, it's how it happened. Download Scoob now on the App Store or Google Play. The truth is never as simple as it seems. In November 1980, Mark David Chapman made his first trip to New York City with one goal in mind: to meet John Lennon. What he found outside the Dakota apartment building was a small community of devoted fans who had made the building their personal pilgrimage site. Chapman introduced himself to 2 women, Judith Stein and Gerald Mall, as a visitor from Hawaii. He revealed that he had been a devoted Beatles fan since his early years and explained how he came to see John Lennon as the mastermind behind the legendary rock band's success. Despite their initial skepticism, after all, Chapman was a stranger and they were in New York City. the women gradually warmed up to this awkward yet enthusiastic fan who had traveled from Hawaii specifically to obtain an autograph from their musical hero. Chapman's appearance wasn't particularly impressive. His round face and extra 50 pounds didn't add to his appeal, but his height and friendly nature made him somewhat endearing. When Jerry incredulously asked, "You mean you came all the way here from Hawaii just to see John?" Chapman confirmed that John Lennon was a key reason for his visit, though he suggested he had other plans in New York beyond just meeting Lennon. Jude and Jerry introduced themselves as quasi-family to the Lennons. They proudly mentioned that they were recognized by name by both Lennon and Yoko Ono, explaining that the famous pair often acknowledged them on their way to Central Park, where Lennon enjoyed afternoon strolls. These two women had struck up a close friendship after meeting about 4 years earlier outside the Dakota. They were among Lennon's most ardent fans, turning the building into their personal shrine. Whenever they planned outings, seeing a film, grabbing lunch, or shopping in the city, they consistently met at the Dakota, always hopeful for a nod or greeting from John or Yoko. Their frequent presence had made them semi-permanent fixtures recognized by the Dakota's doormen and residents, including the Lennons themselves. Persisting through rain, shine, and snow over 4 years, they sometimes even ran errands for the building's famous inhabitants. Chapman observed as the women engaged with passers-by and Dakota residents. At every chance, he would inch closer to their conversations, eager to find an opportunity to join in. He frequently asked newcomers if they had a connection with Lennon, consistently retelling his narrative of how he had traveled from Hawaii with hopes of meeting John Lennon and securing an autograph. What the women didn't know was that Chapman had already made another important connection during this trip, one that would prove crucial when he returned a month later with very different intentions. Now let's go back to a moment that seemed innocent, but would soon take a dark and irreversible turn in the John Lennon murder case. During his first trip to New York, Chapman formed what would become a significant relationship with José Perdomo, one of the doormen at the Dakota. This connection would play a crucial role in the events of December 8, 1980. Chapman spent hours conversing with Perdomo during that initial visit, learning that the doorman was a refugee from communist Cuba. Perdomo had mentioned how fortunate he felt to live in the United States and expressed an appreciation for Hawaii's beauty. Chapman, who lived in Hawaii, appreciated these sentiments, and the two developed a genuine rapport. Their conversations ranged across various topics: Fidel Castro, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and even John F. Kennedy's assassination. Chapman recalled that they agreed on the belief that Castro was potentially linked to Kennedy's death. But Chapman, true to form, often steered the conversation toward John Lennon, eager to learn as much as he could about his idol. Chapman shared his admiration for the Beatles, declaring them creative titans whose music was original and inspired. He bragged that he had traveled all the way from Hawaii just to see Lennon in person. With apparent envy, he remarked how incredible it must be for Perdomo to see such a monumental figure as John Lennon regularly, describing Lennon as akin to a living deity. "I wish I had your job," he confessed. Perdomo recounted other celebrities he'd encountered at the Dakota, mentioning personal contact with Leonard Bernstein, the legendary composer and conductor. Impressed, Chapman acknowledged Bernstein's early and insightful recognition of the Beatles. Many contemporaries had initially dismissed the Beatles as a fleeting musical fad, but Bernstein had foreseen the enduring nature of Lennon and McCartney's works. Chapman passionately predicted that Beatles music would one day achieve classic status, held in the same regard as Beethoven, Bach, and Mozart. To Perdomo, Chapman seemed like an eccentric but harmless character, more outgoing and talkative compared to the usual celebrity admirers who frequently gathered around the Dakota. Perdomo's understanding of English was limited, but he smiled at the tall, pale man who seemed genuinely enthusiastic about music and the Beatles. He categorized Chapman as merely another obsessed fan of John Lennon. When Chapman returned to New York on December 8th, he immediately recognized Perdomo and greeted him warmly, waving an album in the air and calling out, "Hey, José! How are you doing, man? It's me, Mark Chapman. I'm back." Neither man could have known that this friendly reunion would soon turn into one of the darkest nights in music history. Chapman's transformation from devoted Beatles fan to murderer wasn't just about mental illness. It was about perceived betrayal. In Chapman's mind, John Lennon had become the ultimate hypocrite, and this perception fueled a rage that demanded violent resolution. The roots of this hatred traced back to Chapman's fundamentalist Christian beliefs and his interpretation of Lennon's famous 1966 comment that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus. For a young man who had found temporary solace in fervent Christianity, this statement felt like blasphemy. The lingering animosity festered within Chapman, providing fertile ground for the influence of Todd Rundgren's own criticisms of Lennon. Through Rundgren's music, particularly the 1980 album Deface the Music, Chapman found validation for his rage. Rundgren had publicly critiqued Lennon's advocacy of revolution as disingenuous, mocking what he saw as Lennon and Yoko Ono's superficial commitment to revolutionary causes. The track Rock and Roll Pussy specifically disparaged the couple's alleged hypocrisy, highlighting Lennon's perceived indolence while preaching about social change. In Chapman's twisted logic, Lennon represented everything wrong with celebrity culture: a wealthy man preaching about having no possessions, a peace advocate who had abandoned his first son, a revolutionary who lived in luxury. The song Imagine, with its line, "Imagine no possessions," particularly enraged Chapman when he considered Lennon's lavish lifestyle at the Dakota. This perception of hypocrisy became the lens through which Chapman viewed everything about Lennon. The man who sang about peace and love had, in Chapman's mind, become a fraud who needed to be exposed. By killing Lennon, Chapman believed he would reveal the truth about his idol's false persona and simultaneously transform himself from nobody into somebody: the man who killed John Lennon. After Lennon's assassination, questioning by psychologists revealed that Chapman often daydreamed about Rundgren's music alongside musings about Holden Caulfield. Though he later claimed to have been unaware of the publicized conflict between Rundgren and Lennon during his early period of Rundgren fandom, the connection was undeniable. Rundgren had provided the intellectual framework for Chapman's hatred, while Holden Caulfield provided the identity he would assume to carry out his plan. On the day he murdered Lennon, Chapman left Rundgren's album, The Ballad of Todd Rundgren, in his New York City hotel room, a symbolic statement reflecting the profound influence Rundgren's artistry and anti-Lennon sentiment had on his psyche. In the months leading up to the murder, David Chapman's mental state deteriorated dramatically. Those around him began to perceive a man struggling with forces beyond his control, though Chapman himself maintained a different perspective on what was happening to his mind. Chapman insisted he was never possessed by demons, even though he admitted to inviting them. He maintained that the voice urging him to do it, do it, do it, as he aimed and fired his .38 caliber pistol was his own. Even after his arrest and subsequent discussions with psychiatrists, Chapman held firmly to this belief. As a Christian, he felt he couldn't truly be possessed, even though he acknowledged having invited these dark entities. Others around him saw something entirely different. A Christian guard at Rikers Island, a pastor from his hometown, and a prison chaplain all attempted to perform exorcisms, believing demons had taken residence within Chapman after his heinous act. Chapman dismissed these efforts with laughter, angered by the attempts, especially when an officer tried to command the demons to leave him in the name of Jesus. However, this perception changed dramatically after Chapman decided to plead guilty to the murder. As his identity as a symbol of an era, much like the catcher in the rye, began to fall apart, the demons he had claimed were external began to feel disturbingly internal. the man who had previously owned up to his crimes before police and psychiatrists, transformed completely. Suddenly overtaken by violent outbursts, Chapman unleashed a chaotic force within himself. He tore through his Rikers Island cell, destroying televisions, radios, and toilets in fits of destruction attributed to the demons now dancing in his mind. It required 8 guards to subdue him, though he continued to vocally summon these malevolent entities. Chapman's mental state began affecting others, notably fellow inmate Craig Crimmins, notorious as the Phantom of the Opera for murdering a violinist at the Metropolitan Opera. Chapman targeted Crimmins with his so-called demons, speaking through what he claimed were these entities in high-pitched, fearful tones, mimicking the young woman Crimmins had killed. Crimmins, distressed by this ongoing psychological harassment, retaliated by lighting cigarettes and throwing them at Chapman, who was often naked in his cell. The situation became so severe that Crimmins' lawyer intervened legally, seeking protection for his client from Chapman's provocations. He argued that the mental strain imposed by Chapman was driving his client to the brink of insanity. Ultimately, authorities forcibly removed Chapman from his cell and administered stelazine, an antipsychotic medication. The drug had an adverse impact, paralyzing his head, throat, and vocal cords. Worried about further medication and its paralyzing effects, Chapman promised to suppress the chaos of the demons he believed had been sent by a malevolent force. Through this ordeal, Chapman's mental struggles became a stark reminder of the turbulent state of his psyche, a mind that had completely fractured under the weight of his actions and the collapse of his carefully constructed identity. December 8th, 1980, dawned as a day that would forever change the world of music. As evening fell over New York City, Mark David Chapman stood outside the Dakota apartment building, brandishing a John Lennon album he had purchased the previous Saturday. He reminisced about past conversations with José Perdomo, the doorman with whom he had bonded during his earlier visit. Chapman's attention was suddenly drawn to a cheerful group exiting the Dakota building. Among them, some carried tape recorders, while others held cassette tapes. Intent on speaking to the group and hoping to determine whether any of them knew John Lennon, Chapman prepared to approach them. But then a limousine rolled up to the curb, and Perdomo swiftly moved to open the door. A man with a British accent expressed gratitude to Perdomo and discreetly slipped several bills into his hand. Chapman watched as other group members climbed into the limousine. Amid the activity, a voice with an unmistakable British lilt reached Chapman's ears, familiar and unsettling. A chill crept up his spine, sending shivers down his neck and back. Chapman had finally encountered the object of his obsession, John Lennon himself, in the flesh, just feet away. But this wasn't the moment Chapman had planned. His elaborate fantasy, carefully constructed over months, involved a very different scenario. He had envisioned Lennon collapsing instantly at his feet, allowing Chapman to wrap himself in a fetal position beside the bleeding musician and melt into the world of Holden Caulfield. Instead, when Chapman finally acted on his deadly impulses later that evening, reality refused to conform to his fantasy. Lennon, though fatally wounded, sprang up and dashed up the stone steps, only collapsing after crashing through the glass door at the Dakota building's entryway. This unexpected turn left Chapman in shock. Lennon had not instantly died as Chapman had envisioned. The aftermath revealed that nothing had altered in the fundamental way Chapman had anticipated. His grand gesture, meant to transform him from nobody into somebody, from Mark Chapman into Holden Caulfield, had failed to provide the identity and meaning he so desperately sought. Instead, he was left standing on a sidewalk, having just committed the most senseless act of violence against the very person he had once worshipped. The man who had traveled from Hawaii, seeking an autograph, had instead delivered death. The fan who had bonded with doormen and fellow admirers had become the villain in their story. And the troubled young man who had been searching for an identity his entire life had finally found one. Murderer. Over 4,800 miles away from the scene of the crime, in Kailua, Hawaii. Gloria Hiroko Chapman was watching television when she saw a news flash about John Lennon's murder. Even before the assailant's name was mentioned, she instinctively knew her husband was involved. This intuition didn't come as a profound shock to her, perhaps because 2 months prior, Mark had disclosed his lethal intentions. He had mentioned during their conversation that he might kill John Lennon, but later assured her that he had reconsidered and thrown his gun into the ocean. Gloria believed him when he said his return trip to New York was for personal growth, a time for reflection to mature into a better husband and adult. His request for her to endure brief separations for the sake of a long and happy marriage had resonated with her at the time. 38 years after the murder, during Mark's 10th attempt at parole in August 2018, Gloria finally revealed this knowledge to the public. By then, she was a 69-year-old woman with graying hair, a former vivacious travel agent who had first met Mark when he requested her help planning a round-the-world trip. Gloria had remained steadfastly by Mark's side throughout the years, despite their strained and often violent marriage. Her commitment persisted even though she had endured his abusive behavior during their short, tension-filled marriage, a stark indication of his capability for violence that should have served as a warning of what was to come. In communication via email, Gloria expressed hesitation about meeting in person or discussing visits to her incarcerated husband. The scrutiny that accompanies their notoriety causes concerns about negative publicity, particularly around parole hearings. Despite the profound changes in her life since the infamous event, Gloria continues to stand by Mark. Their shared existence is punctuated by 44 hours of privacy each year during conjugal visits at New York's Wenda Correctional Facility, a small caravan home within the prison grounds where they can be a couple, however briefly, free from the watchful eyes of the world. This time, less than 2 days annually, allows them some semblance of normalcy. The irony is stark and cruel. Yoko Ono has no such time with John Lennon. While Mark remains physically imprisoned, the psychological confinement seems more profound. Even if he were to be granted parole, he remains forever locked away within the confines of his own heart and actions, a punishment that no amount of freedom can relieve. Gloria's story reveals the ripple effects of Chapman's crime, how it destroyed not just John Lennon's life, but damaged everyone in its wake, including the woman who loved the killer and somehow found the strength to stand by him through nearly 4 decades of imprisonment. Dr. Naomi Goldstein holds the distinction of being the first mental health professional to evaluate Mark David Chapman, conducting her assessment less than 24 hours after the murder. Unlike the dozen other specialists who would later examine Chapman's psyche, many of whom had personal, legal, or financial motivations, Dr. Goldstein approached the case with pure professional intent. Before meeting Chapman, Dr. Goldstein had interviewed numerous murderers and would go on to consult with hundreds of additional violent criminals. Yet, reflecting 12 years later, she expressed that Chapman's case remained the most enigmatic she had ever encountered, describing it as entirely unique. During her interview on December 9, 1980, Chapman was eagerly forthcoming, sharing every intricate detail of his life, regardless of how trivial or humiliating, in an effort to gain insight into his identity, something he had never managed to understand. He revealed having toyed with the idea of committing suicide by jumping from the Statue of Liberty's crown purely for its originality, but lost his nerve when he imagined surviving the fall with his brains exposed yet still living. Dr. Goldstein found herself compelled to defer any immediate diagnosis. Chapman seemingly exhibited symptoms of almost every psychiatric anomaly documented, yet ironically remained coherent, eloquent, and notably aware of everyday realities, all markers typically used to assess mental health. He explicitly confronted the grim reality of the murder he had perpetrated and fully realized the global bereavement his actions had triggered. To Goldstein and her peers, Chapman appeared to possess an elevated sensitivity to ethical issues and broad social concerns. He demonstrated comprehension regarding the link between historical actions and their subsequent outcomes. He was well aware of the connection between murder and punishment, admitting uncertainty whether his actions would subject him to the electric chair or gas chamber. Crucially, he expressed apathy over the possibility. Dr. Goldstein's extensive court-ordered examination concluded with observations that Chapman craved constant attention and recognition, exhibited grandiose self-perceptions, and displayed symptoms including depression, mood swings, anger, paranoia, suicidal tendencies, rage, and personal confusion. Despite these observations, she found herself unable to determine a definitive psychiatric reason behind Chapman's motivation for killing Lennon. The complexity of the case, she postulated, extended beyond contemporary psychiatric understanding. Upon deeming Chapman competent to face legal charges, she recommended that the judiciary, rather than the healthcare system, decide his fate. Even a decade later, Chapman's case lingered in Dr. Goldstein's thoughts as she reviewed other cases for insights that might clarify this enigmatic patient. Although she suspected Chapman exhibited certain psychiatric irregularities, she was uncomfortable with the simplistic labels others assigned to both the crime and its perpetrator. According to Goldstein, who described him as very quixotic and extremely mercurial, Chapman's condition defied classification. Mercurial personality disorder didn't exist within the psychiatric lexicon. Even nearly 12 years after their first encounter, Dr. Goldstein remained uncertain if she or anyone else could accurately assign a psychiatric label to Chapman. Her ambivalence was shared by other psychiatrists who evaluated Lennon's killer, considering him one of their most challenging diagnoses. They all wrestled with elucidating the psychiatric symptoms underpinning the spiritual conflict Chapman claimed had simmered within him throughout his life. This diagnostic uncertainty raises disturbing questions. If some of the nation's top psychiatric experts couldn't understand Chapman's mind, how can we hope to identify and prevent similar tragedies in the future? On June 22, 1981, Mark David Chapman pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. On August 24th, he was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison, marking the beginning of what would become a lengthy incarceration within the New York State prison system. But Chapman's next destination would bring him face to face with yet another connection to his victim. Chapman's anxiety intensified when he learned he was being transferred to Attica Correctional Facility, infamous for the deadly prison riot in September 1971, the most violent in U.S. history, claiming 43 lives. His fear was compounded by the knowledge that John Lennon had been engaged in humanitarian efforts related to Attica. In 1971, Lennon had performed his first public concert in the United States as a benefit for the survivors and families of those prisoners killed during the riot. This performance was immortalized in the song Attica State on his album Sometime in New York City. Knowing he was headed to this facility, Chapman, overcome by fear of possible retribution from fellow inmates who were Beatles fans, retreated into himself in a state of panic. His terror manifested physically as he curled into a fetal position under a blanket in his cell, refusing to respond or show his face to prison staff. A chaplain from the correction department visited him, offering words of reassurance and spiritual guidance, telling Chapman he would be placed in protective custody with other notorious criminals. The chaplain prayed over him to drive away what he sensed were demonic influences tormenting Chapman. After several hours, under heavy security, Chapman embarked on a daunting 400-mile journey to Attica via armored bus. As he arrived, the imposing sight of the towering, high-walled fortress reminded him of a distorted version of the Dakota building, the site where he had committed his crime. Meanwhile, Gloria Chapman demonstrated remarkable devotion by leaving her job in Honolulu and relocating to a small town in New York near Attica. Despite prison restrictions, she visited almost every day. Under surveillance cameras in a secured visiting room, They held hands and shared spiritual solace through Bible readings and religious studies. Gloria found employment in a local department store and arranged to live with members of her church community. Although the couple faced stringent restrictions, she was resolute in her commitment to remain nearby for as long as necessary, even if it meant waiting the full 20 years. She held on to hope and believed in their enduring love, even after receiving long, drawn-out letters from Chapman during his time at Rikers, where he had expressed reluctance to maintain contact. Chapman's life in prison became a strange mirror of his life outside, isolated, dependent on the attention and care of others, and forever defined by his relationship to John Lennon. The man who had killed his idol in hopes of achieving fame and identity found himself in a place where his notoriety made him a target, requiring the very protection he had sought to escape through his violent act. In the months before his death, John Lennon had been expressing thoughts that, in retrospect, seem eerily prophetic. According to Frederick Seaman, who served as Lennon's personal secretary and assistant during the final 2 years of his life, the musician had become obsessed with mystical concepts of death and rebirth. Seaman observed that Lennon was painfully aware of replicating the same mistakes his father had made with him in his relationship with his son Julian. This realization weighed heavily on Lennon because he had once vowed never to subject his own child to the same neglect he had endured. His childhood was marred by an absent father, and despite his intentions, he found himself trapped in a cycle he had desperately wanted to break. From the beginning of their relationship, Seaman noticed what he called a tragic flaw within Lennon, an obsession with mystical subjects, particularly death. Lennon often engaged in long discussions about such matters, inspired by the books he was reading. During the last year of his life, discussions about violence and death became frequent. One particularly telling anecdote involved Lennon's repeated inquiries about a shooting incident that Seaman's uncle had experienced in 1978. Lennon's fascination with his uncle's account of being shot, endlessly asking about the sensations and thoughts that ran through his mind, illustrated his compelling interest in mortality. During evenings spent smoking marijuana and listening to reggae music, Lennon would delve into these morbid interests, revealing the depth of his preoccupation with death. Seaman speculated that Lennon's troubled childhood and awareness that he had subjected Julian to similar experiences contributed to an internal struggle that possibly led him to unconsciously plot his own demise. This theory aligns with Lennon's engrossing fixation on mystical concepts of death and rebirth. Whether intentional or not, this preoccupation may have inadvertently drawn the attention of a disturbed individual like Mark David Chapman. On the evening of December 8th, between 11 p.m. and midnight, Seaman exited a movie theater with a companion when he received heartbreaking news from a distraught person on a New York City sidewalk. John Lennon had been fatally shot. Reflecting on that moment, Seaman noted how the morbid conversations he had shared with Lennon began to take on chilling logic. It seemed as if Lennon had some foreboding instinct, or perhaps even a subconscious yearning to die as a martyr. Despite expressing concerns about his personal safety, Lennon had neglected to adopt basic security measures, such as having a bodyguard, which might have saved his life. According to Seaman, Lennon's challenge was that he possessed vast theoretical knowledge, but struggled to apply it practically to his own life and situation. The question remains haunting. Did John Lennon somehow sense his approaching fate? His obsession with death, his careless attitude toward security, and his documented premonitions suggest a man who may have unconsciously courted the very danger that ultimately claimed his life. Nearly a decade into his imprisonment, Mark David Chapman began to confront the seething animosity that had defined his relationship with his father for most of his life. "My father and I love each other very much now," Chapman stated, noting that they had begun corresponding via letters and occasionally speaking over the phone. Chapman expressed that his father had forgiven him for all the horrible things he had said during his arrest. This reconciliation represented a significant shift for Chapman, who had spent years harboring violent fantasies about confronting his father. the rage he had felt toward David Chapman for his emotional distance, his failure to provide guidance, and his treatment of Chapman's mother, had been one of the driving forces behind his psychological deterioration. Despite this reconciliation, Chapman couldn't entirely escape the emotional void that had characterized their father-son relationship for so many years. He described his father as someone who adhered to monotonous routines, lacking emotional literacy. Although David Chapman had fulfilled conventional paternal roles, abstaining from alcohol and being physically present, he had failed to express affection or engage in meaningful conversations with his son. Chapman reflected that while they had participated in activities like Boy Scouts and Indian Guides, vital emotional connections were absent. He seldom recalled shared moments of tenderness or declarations of love from his father, describing him as a man who repressed his emotions until they burst forth destructively. The most vivid memory from his childhood remained that Thanksgiving dinner marked by his father's explosive outburst, descending the stairs, muttering and cursing before picking up the turkey with bare hands and smashing it on the table. This moment epitomized the unpredictable and intimidating presence his father had represented throughout his youth. Significantly, David Chapman never visited his son in prison. The elder Chapman's life following his son's incarceration was marked by personal struggles. He remarried twice, suffered 6 heart attacks, and in early 1992 experienced a debilitating stroke. This stroke temporarily regressed his mind to 18 years old, erasing memories of his children, including Chapman's sister, Susan. When reminiscing about his childhood and family, Chapman often overlooks his sister's existence, choosing instead to focus on his father as a perplexing figure, dutiful yet emotionally distant, unable to connect with his family. The reconciliation, while meaningful, came too late to heal the fundamental wounds that had shaped Chapman's twisted psyche. The tragedy extends beyond Chapman's relationship with his father to encompass his entire approach to human connection. Just as he had transformed John Lennon from a person into a symbol, Chapman had reduced his father to a representation of everything wrong with authority and masculinity. When that symbol failed to provide the meaning Chapman sought, he turned his rage toward an even more symbolic figure, ultimately destroying not just Lennon's life, but any possibility of genuine human connection for himself. When the headlines fade, the questions remain. At Scoob, we don't just recount crimes, we investigate the silence that follows. From celebrity murders to long-buried scandals, our AI-powered true crime podcasts dig deeper into the evidence, the motives, and the people the world forgot. Trusted by over 50,000 listeners in the U.S., Scoob delivers raw, revealing, and relentless storytelling, cutting through rumor to uncover reality. Download Scoob now on the App Store or Google Play. Because behind every icon, there's a story the cameras missed. Mark David Chapman sits in his cell today, decades after committing one of the most senseless crimes in modern history. He has been denied parole multiple times, each hearing bringing renewed pain to John Lennon's family and fans worldwide. The man who once sought identity through violence has become nothing more than a number in the prison system, exactly the kind of anonymity he had tried so desperately to escape. But Chapman's story is more than just a tale of one man's psychological collapse. It's a cautionary narrative about the dangerous intersection of fame, mental illness, and the human need for identity. It reveals how celebrity culture can create toxic relationships between fans and their idols, relationships that exist only in the fan's imagination, but can have devastatingly real consequences. Chapman thought killing John Lennon would make him famous, would give him the identity he had never possessed. Instead, he became a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when obsession replaces genuine human connection, when fantasy becomes more compelling than reality, and when the desperate search for meaning leads to the ultimate meaningless act. John Lennon died on December 8, 1980, but his music, his message of peace and love, and his artistic legacy continue to inspire millions around the world. David Chapman achieved the notoriety he sought, but at the cost of becoming one of the most reviled figures in modern history. The question that haunts us isn't just why Chapman did what he did. It's how we can prevent future tragedies like this one. How do we identify and help people like Chapman before their fantasies turn deadly? How do we protect the artists and public figures who bring beauty and meaning to our world? These are questions without easy answers, but they're questions we must continue asking. Because somewhere out there, another troubled individual might be constructing elaborate fantasies, seeking identity through violence, transforming real people into abstract symbols ripe for destruction. David Chapman killed John Lennon, but he couldn't kill what Lennon represented, the power of music to heal, to inspire, and to bring people together. In the end, that may be Chapman's greatest failure. Not that he committed murder, but that his act of violence ultimately strengthened the very ideals he sought to destroy. The music plays on, the message of peace endures, and Chapman remains exactly what he always was, a nobody, desperately seeking to become somebody, who instead became a cautionary tale about the dangers of losing oneself in the fantasy of violence.